Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming, and to St. Joseph's College for having me for the speaker series. It's my great pleasure. Now, I wanted to talk to you today a bit about how I came to write American Character, what the book aims to accomplish, and a bit about its premises, and be able to touch a little on their conclusions, which I think have valence for a lot of things going on in the world and the nation today. How many of you happen to have read the previous book, American Nations? A few of you. I'll bring the rest of you up to speed a little bit, because this new book takes up the problem that American Nations left readers with. And the central argument in American Nations was that, let me just switch the slides. In American Nations was that you can't understand American history, the American identity, or indeed our current political cleavages, which are geographic even as they are ideological, without knowing that there's never been just one America, but rather several Americas. That we're not a nation-state, we're a federation of several stateless nations, regional cultures that have always had their own characteristics, most tied back to differences between the initial Euro-American colonies that formed on the eastern and southwestern rims of what are now the United States, in the 17th and early 18th centuries. Now, the original clusters of North American colonies, which you see up here, were settled by people from distinct regions and parts of the British Isles, and from France and the Netherlands and Spain, each with their own religious, political, and ideological differences and characteristics. And for generations, these discrete Euro-American regional cultures developed in remarkable isolation from one another, consolidating their own cherished principles and fundamental values, and expanding across the eastern half of the continent in mutually exclusive settlement bands. Now, some of these regional cultures championed individualism, others utopian social reform. Some believed themselves to be guided by divine purpose, others championed freedom of conscience and inquiry. Some embraced an explicit Anglo-Protestant identity, I'm looking at you, Yankeedom, others ethnic and religious pluralism. Some valued equality and public participation in politics, others deference to a traditional aristocratic order modeled on the slave states of classical antiquity. They laid down the cultural DNA of their respective regions as they colonized them. The institutions, this is from the southern rim of the country, the institutions and values, unspoken assumptions and symbols and narratives about who we are, their legal and social framework, in short, all the different aspects of what we think of as culture. So there's never been one America, there's been 11 Americas. And today, you can see them all there on this large map at county-level resolution. Now, how do they do this? What is this map really showing you? What am I talking about? Well, let me just break down a little bit of one of these regions and how it's spread, and I think you'll get the idea of what this map is actually depicting. Let's take Yankeedom, where we are. Starting out, it began with the Puritan migration in the 1630s to Massachusetts Bay, and the Puritans arrived and they took over and the surrounding colonies, the Royalist settlements that were in Maine, the old colony of the Pilgrims on Cape Cod, and soon annexed and pulled into its orbit the other parts of New England, bringing in New Hampshire and Connecticut. Well, later, when the Dutch were defeated in the 1670s, the Dutch founded what's now New York City and controlled much of the Hudson Valley, but when they were defeated in the Anglo-Dutch Wars, there ended up being a bit of a problem there about what was going to happen. What were we going to do, who's going to have sovereignty over it? Because if you remember back in your high school and junior high American history, oftentimes you'd see a map of the United States with all the different early colonies, and they'd all look a little bit like the original 13 colonies, except they'd have these strips about as wide as each colony that extended all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Right? You know, we claim, in theory, we don't know where the next ocean is, but we claim all the land in the width of our colony all the way to whatever the next ocean is. And so that was their legal claim on a lot of their, deeds and charters. This created a bit of a problem, though, because when the Dutch were defeated and the new state of New York was being created, it was to be a royalist, possession of the king's brother, the Duke of York, except that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts said, wait, we claim a Massachusetts-wide strip all the way to the Pacific, including millions of acres of upstate New York. It's all supposed to be ours. Well, this caused a bit of a problem. As you might imagine, the king's brother won the argument over the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, but there was a compromise made. Yeah, That whole strip would be given, New York would be given sovereignty over it, but the actual land title, who owned the disputed land, was turned over to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which directed settlement of that strip of land across all of that of upstate New York. And often it was settled by, the Calvinist, post-Puritan clergymen and entire villages on the move, a whole flock coming with them to the frontier in the Yankee style, and going to the frontier and immediately establishing a town green, taxing each other to build a public school system, building that up in a meeting house, dividing out the land equally according to community and public institutional values, because that's the way that the Puritans and the culture that they expanded across Yankeedom ticked, right? The early Puritans believed themselves to be in a sort of Old Testament covenant with, right? They were God's chosen people. They were coming to put a light on the hill to create a new Zion and a more perfect society as they understood it in their interpretation of Calvinism. And they were going to do it through shared institutions, right? The key was they were going to build a better community, and the individual, if they got in the way, was supposed to stand down, right? The interests of the common good trumped the interests of the individual. It's a very New England idea that that be the case, and an idea that's very alien to many of the other regional cultures. It means that the greater New England cultural space, as it expanded, brought with them a greater level of comfort than a lot of the other regional cultures have with government and the idea that government and public institutions can do well or can create better outcomes or build and engineer a better society. There's the New England and greater New England faith in that that's alien to a lot of the other regions. And it comes from the early origins and the institutions that they laid out, because we have town governments, right? The Puritans were extremely concerned that there might be an aristocracy that would form. So everything was sort of devised around ensuring that the corrupt aristocracy that they'd fled back in England did not come and replicate itself in the New World. So every level of government beyond the town level was considered suspect, right? The dukes and counts might take over that. We can't have strong counties. They have to be very weak because they might become despots. So there's this very strong idea of local control, which you feel in Maine, where each one of our towns is like a tiny republic into itself, where you actually have town meetings in many communities still, where the citizens themselves get together and act as the legislative branch, approving the budget items. That is a totally bizarre idea in large regions of the country where towns don't really exist. The counties have all the power until you get, part of a county that gets big enough to have a city might get an independent status, but everything is done at a much larger level. The idea that government is us is not an assumption that goes deep into the culture of other regional cultures. It does in this one, and it has large implications for all kinds of things in the American conversation and federalism. So, proceeding on with the story, later on, when the West was starting to open up, and at that time the West was, Ohio and Indiana, there was the old Northwest Territory of the federal government, and when that was being created and the new Ohio Territory was going to be created, the same problem came up again. Because you see in Ohio, that dark blue Yankee strip at the top of Ohio along the lake, that's the Western Reserve. It's the Western Reserve of Connecticut. Because Connecticut claimed a strip all the way to Pacific as wide as Connecticut. And in Ohio, that was the strip that was contended. Same thing happened. In the end, the federal government said, okay, Ohio gets sovereignty, but the Commonwealth of Connecticut gets to have land title. And Connecticuters came and settled that region and only that region of Ohio, which is why many of the communities that you find in Ohio are named after ones back in Connecticut, and where they were replicating many times New England-style towns with their town green and the meeting house and the public square in ways that you don't find in parts of Ohio that were settled via Virginia or otherwise. Generation later, Michigan Territory is being created. Almost all of the initial settlers coming into the Michigan Territory, the people who were the territorial governors, the members of the territorial legislatures who sat and created the state constitutional conventions for Michigan, and 4 of the 5 initial Michigan governors were all from the Yankee settled Western Reserve of Connecticut, the Yankee upstate of New York, or New England itself. Ditto, generation later for Wisconsin and Minnesota. So it was laying out and bringing the cultural norms and institutional ideas and values and sort of formatting the hard drive. The New Englanders may have quickly become a minority, but there's the fact that they were the first movers in and set a lot of the assumptions, ended up being the cultural milieu and ethos that later immigrants found and would assimilate into. Maybe modify, but that was the core ideas there. And those ideas were not present in other regions of the country. So that's what you're seeing in here, and you could have another region like, say, Greater Appalachia that would be entirely different. So this started in the 1630s. Greater Appalachia began with a gigantic migration in the 1730s and 1740s from a very different part of England, not from the lower southeastern counties of England where the Puritans tended to come from, but from the war-ravaged borderlands of the British Isles, from the English marches and the lowlands of Scotland and from Ulster itself, places that had been constantly in a state of conflict and upheaval. And the people who came from those regions came to the back country of the Pennsylvania colony, up in that very top upper right section of that dark red you see there, and worked down through the frontier. And they brought with them a culture that had been formed at a time and a place where there was very little effective government on the ground. If government and public institutions came, they usually came in the form of a bunch of enemy horsemen with lances trying to mow down your family, where there was no sort of police and government to count on except to come and loot you for taxes. And so in that culture, you had to protect your kith and kin yourself. It was a warrior culture where freedom was defined in very individual terms, and you had to maximize your individual autonomy and individual and personal sovereignty and protect your own yourself by force of arms. And they ended up being very useful people to bring in as settlers if you wanted to protect your backcountry during times when the Native Americans were trying to hold on to their land. And you had disputes going on the back parts of many of these colonies, including Maine. A whole bunch of Scots-Irish were brought into the mid-coast at a critical portion by some of the great proprietors like Samuel Waldo, specifically to protect the effete, weak little coastal settlements. They put all these warrior people out on the rugged frontier. It has lots of implications, though, politically later down the road, because there are also people who weren't necessarily going to back down if they felt their property rights and stuff were being infringed on. And that culture spread over a completely different region, down the wagon road, down the chain of the Appalachian Mountains, spreading into the back country of what was then places like Virginia and South Carolina, into the northern parts of Georgia, and indeed on into the Ozarks, and as far as the Texas Hill Country, but also rafting down the Ohio River to settle the lower tiers of places like Ohio and Indiana and Illinois. A very different culture, and one whose views on government are quite the opposite. The orderly government of New Englanders itself would be seen as the threat to freedom within Greater Appalachia. And so you can imagine the kind of conflicts that you would have to have a federation that has even just these two entities without another 9 with different takes on some of these big issues. As you might imagine, all of this historical bequest we have has all kinds of profound effects on political behavior. The lines in this map you can see in the county level results of almost any hotly contested election in history. Hey, check it out. And you can't look just at the blue state, red state map. You really got to go to the blue county, red county map. I mean, look at this presidential election. You can see Yankeedom. You can even see the Western Reserve Ohio popping in one color and the upper tiers of some of those Great Lakes states. You can see the left coast set out against the rest of the interior of Washington and California and Oregon and Northern California. You can see an almost monolithic, solid tidewater and deep south portion there. So it's pretty amazing. I haven't messed with the colors, by the way. Red really is Republican and blue is Democrat, because this is not a recent election. This is the 1916 showdown between Woodrow Wilson and Charles Hughes. Here's a lesson for you. Trying to track American political history through a partisan lens is a fool's errand. Parties come and go. Where are the Whigs today? And where are the Federalists? And what happened to them all? But also, parties change radically. Since in the 100 years, in fact, in the past 50 years, Republican Democratic parties have switched essentially their platforms and their constituencies and their regional bases almost perfectly. They've just swapped chairs. There's the 2008 presidential election. Same map, essentially, right? You can see it just switched colors. You got the Yankeedom, Western Reserve Ohio, the left coast. You can see the Midland zone is still quite unsure which way to go. Couple changes, though, from 1916 in that time period. One of them is that you can see El Norte, the area settled by New Spain. There's a Spanish project coming north to south. It suddenly appeared as a very obvious outlines in a different color than its surroundings. And also, you're starting to see that it's not a single color in the deep south and Tidewater. Well, what's going on? Well, in that time period, Hispanics and African Americans were able to exercise the franchise effectively, which they weren't in 1916. And those are, sadly, almost entirely only African American counties, because in the deep south especially, and still Tidewater to some extent, partisan choices and race are closely correlated. And here in El Norte, which also had an effective racial caste system, Hispanics were able to vote and stand for office and exercise the franchise, and you can see the dramatic difference. But otherwise, it's the same map as 100 years ago, just the parties have reverted since the Southern strategy under Nixon had the beginnings of that changeover, which is now complete. And so that brings you up to the coalitions that we have today. I mean, these days, what you end up having is two coalitions, and we end up deadlocked for this reason. The reason that the country is so polarized and politics are so polarized is that for some time now, a couple decades, neither of our political formations really has a supermajority deadlock that allows them to control the levers of federal power. We have two weak coalitions that can't do it on their own. And they're not really convincing the swing nations in between of their arguments in any effective way that leads to a lasting coalition of the sort that would govern for decades at a time. We've had decades where one general idea or set of values or platform had a coalition which was able to have a filibuster-proof Senate majority, the White House, and the House at the same time, and govern federal institutions. It didn't always used to be one party that had it because the parties weren't ideologically sorted the way they are now, but you would have these big coalitions in the Gilded Age, in the Progressive era, in the Greater New Deal period. Well, we've lost that now because the coalitions now, the Democrats only have a reliable coalition that goes Yankeedom, left coast, and the little area in light blue there right around New York City, which is the Dutch cultural zone still called New Netherland. Commercial trading republic, city-state, freedom of conscience and inquiry, and an emphasis on tolerance. So those three are one coalition. Doesn't give you on the Electoral College any of those three things I described by itself. And in the solid red coalition is currently Greater Appalachia, the Deep South, and the Interior West, the Far West. Those aren't enough for them either. So what you have is the other swing nations are kind of deciding as Kingmaker, and they're not sold on either party's platforms. And it's led to a sort of unstable situation. All of a sudden you have one election, oh my gosh, Party A is vanquished forever. We'll never see them again. It's going to be 40 years of Party B. And then the next election, oh, Party B has vanquished them. It's going to be the end for Party A for 40 years. Keeps flipping back and forth on a knife's edge with very, very close elections. And that's because of this particular situation that we're in today. So how would you get to the point where you would have some kind of consensus, a broad American consensus, that would deliver you the kind of supermajorities to govern with our constitutional system in some kind of effective way at the federal level? And to get one or the other political formation is going to have to change their offerings in some way to do that. But how? In what way would you do it? Well, that's the mission that American Character took on, delving into history about our experience in our political ideas and value system to try to figure out where it would be, as a practical matter, what would be a program that would get a super majority coalition together and allow the country to function and move forward as the world's only superpower. And so at the outset, in order to decode or answer this sort of question, you have to ask yourself, what is the key conflict point in our politics? And my argument is that the American political conversation has always been about freedom. How do you make a free society? How do you better improve upon it? What's the way forward in that? And that's not the norm for most countries. In other countries, it might be fairness in New Zealand, or simply order, or maintaining the nation's independence from, if you're in a small country with hostile surroundings, that becomes the political conversation constantly behind everything else. But in ours, it's always been circulating around the idea of freedom. But there's a conflict about these competing definitions of freedom that are encoded in these regional cultures. Are we talking the individual form or the community form of it, right? Because there's two ways of looking at it. It's that sort of Greater Appalachian way where having a free society is about maximizing the freedom of individuals, that is axiomatically what makes people free, and that government is a source of tyranny. And there's the other that's no, it's about building the community infrastructure to maintain and perpetuate a free society. Well, there's a spectrum of things in there. You don't want to run in an extreme in either direction. Individualism on one side, collectivism on the other. Because if you err too far in either direction, bad things end up happening, you end up losing your freedom. For instance, if you err towards the common good, if you ask yourself in the center, if individual freedom and the common good come into conflict, on which side should you err? I mean, everybody will have different answers, and maybe different answers in different contexts. And if you erring consistently out on the common good side of things, you're going to enter into a sort of communitarian space at first. And then if you keep on going further along, you end up into social democracy, which there's a lot of confusion in the United States these days as to what that means. But social democracy, you have a vigorous free market economic system that is harnessed to support or through fairly high taxes, a very robust set of social and cultural infrastructure to, in theory, maintain and make a better society. If you keep on going down that direction of the common good and strengthening it, you end up in socialism, where it's no longer necessarily a free market economy, that the government and the public sector have actually nationalized and taken control of at least the big chunks of industry, the big mines and power plants and all that. But in more orthodox socialism, you end up with every single street vendor, kiosk, and restaurant is controlled by the state. And it's supposedly, in a lot of theories, you're supposed to, if you keep on going down that area, you'll end up in some kind of nirvana of communism where the state withers away and we as individuals all become new men who are newly enlightened and more pure and better and rational than before, more free. But that never actually happens in the historical record, because what really happens is the keepers of the common good are people and individuals, and they start looking upon, with all the plans they're trying to make, dissenting and unorthodox and idiosyncratic individual thoughts and behavior as being disruptive at best and perhaps a danger to the common good at worst. And you can start restricting those things. For the good of the common good, we're going to restrict those things. You can start committing thought crimes. Simply thinking certain things becomes bad, and you end up pretty soon in that Orwellian realm where you're supposed to surrender to the superego of the party or the fatherland or whatever it is that has been given this extreme duty to protect the common good, and you end up with Orwell and Stalin's Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany, and, well, that's right, so let's not do that. We'd better go in the other direction. But the problem is, if you go in the other direction on the spectrum, the same thing happens if you start going too far. That's the trick of it all. Because you come a bit down onto the individual thing, the idea that, if you had just had lower taxes, less government, less regulations, you would have to have more freedom, right? That it's a zero-sum game between the government and the individuals, and axiomatically we'll be more free if there's less of all those things. And that gets you in sort of a libertarian argument about it, that would be the best way to move forward. But if you keep going down that individual liberty slide, if you keep saying less and less taxes and less government, less and less regulation, and it starts shrinking and shrinking away, funny enough, more individuals don't become free. We know what happens as you work away that way. The libertarian space, it's what would have been called liberalism under John Locke. The second half of the word neoliberal is where that comes from. But you keep going, and the government's ability or willingness to step in as a referee in economic, social, and other matters starts disappearing. Inequality starts growing immensely as the gains of this new free system, they tend to accrue, and the historical record shows us, asymmetrically, not just to the most able, but also to the most rapacious, or simply those who were born into a vast inheritance from the previous generation. So the space for everybody else to have a fair shake at birth starts disappearing with a contraction of all those leveling mechanisms that normally exist in the state: progressive taxation, quality public schools and universities, parks, libraries, all that stuff that allows somebody unfortunately born to have a chance at that meritocratic struggle that keeps everything free. And as that happens, you end up, if you keep on going down that, history shows us that you end up with ideologies, consummate rise of ideologies that try to justify that increasing gulf and chasm in possibilities and opportunity. That one of the common ones you get is the social Darwinist idea that the rich deserve more freedom because they're more virtuous, and that the poor deserve less because they have moral and possibly genetic shortcomings. We've been through that in the United States and plenty of other countries. You further along, you end up reaching the radical libertarian thought of objectivism and Ayn Rand, wherein altruism and public-mindedness are literally and explicitly condemned as evil. And if you keep going to the logical extreme, you would theoretically wind up in anarchy, or maybe some kind of anarcho-capitalism if you're a real optimist, where the government vanishes and might makes right, but you know what? You never actually get there either. Because what's actually happened in real existing history, time and time again, is those few families maximize their freedom and take it away from everybody else to become an oligarchy. That's what happened in medieval Hungary when the nobles ended up restricting in the 10th century the powers of the king because they wanted to have more powers, and they immediately used their freedom to re-enslave the entire peasant class of the country and refused to pay taxes to the center so that there was no standing army left in Hungary when the Ottoman Turks arrived in the southern border and invaded and placed Hungary in a 3-century long Ottoman yoke. Became part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Kingdom of Hungary disappeared. But more recently, in the 20th century, just look at late 20th century El Salvador, or Guatemala, or Honduras, where the 8 families, or the 10 families, or the 12 families have managed to maximize their freedom quite effectively, so that they control almost all the land, all of the businesses, the army, the courts, and eliminate anybody who gets in their way. So, oh my gosh, well, that's a bad thing too. What are we going to do? Well, logically, if going into an extreme in either direction fosters tyranny and ends up destroying a free society, then as a theoretical matter, there must be a sweet spot somewhere in the middle, right? Where the two essential and important forces of freedom are, in fact, in equilibrium. That's a tricky thing, right? Because circumstances are always changing around us in society. And so that's why it's so hard maintaining a liberal democracy, a democracy where the goal is to try to maximize individual and hopefully universal freedom, that big project of the Enlightenment that American Republic has been trying to do. That's why it's so tricky, is because you've got to figure out where the equilibrium point is constantly in changing circumstances. And that's not easy. The paradox is that you can't have widespread individual liberty without the civil, social, and public infrastructure to support it over time. Because lest we forget, at our own peril, that there's nothing natural at all about a liberal democracy existing as a form of government. Absolutely not. It's an extraordinary human achievement that we can aspire to have free societies like this. It was eons in the making, and it only had 4 centuries of cautious and not always successful experimentation. In the 5,000 years that our species has had complex civilizations, despotism and autocracy have been the norm. Universal freedom wasn't even part of the worldview until 4, 3, maybe even 2 centuries ago, really. Medieval thought in Western Europe was, say, that of John of Salisbury, was the idea that society was an organism like a body, right? Where you had the head was the king, and one arm were the soldiers, and the other arm were the tax collectors, and all the peasants and common people were the legs moving things around, and that the priests were the soul that were occupied all of it and guided it, and that everything was harmonious and everything had its place as organs within a solid and full organism. That's not at all an atomized, individualistic view of things. Western Civ's idea was a highly communal thing where the individual didn't even exist as an idea. You were all part of this broader superorganism kind of idea. Well, what about ancient Greece and Rome? We read about those as the precedents for our democracy, and that's why we have all these neoclassical buildings in Washington, D.C., right? Except ancient Greece and Rome were not liberal democracies. They were slave states, right? They were slave states where a small minority had the privilege or the liberty of practicing democracy, and that submission and slavery was the natural lot of the many. In fact, the central idea was that you could only have a republic if many people were enslaved. That was the only way that it could be stable. That is the tradition, by the way, that the Deep South, founded initially by planters from the British West Indies island of Barbados going into Charleston, were replicating explicitly the classical Republican view of how society should be organized, which is how you could have a slaveholding, racially based slaveholding system living inside a supposedly liberal democratic republic. It was that little twist that we're talking classical republicanism that was at the center of it. So mass individual freedom requires a government of sufficient strength to ensure our American competition remains free and fair, by avoiding monopoly in the economic zone, cheating in this economic sphere, but also to avoid intergenerational monopolies of opportunity, and thus liberty in the social sphere, right? You need those libraries and healthcare systems and colleges and parks and transportation and water supplies and the taxes to support them enough. Otherwise, you can end up at least 2 or 3 generations down the road with an aristocracy. It also, though, requires, and all the Enlightenment thinkers and Alexis de Tocqueville and everybody else who's looked at America has talked about this, is that cultivation of a Republican citizenry. You know, the habits of the heart. In order for a representative democracy where we're all going to be sovereign to work, you have to have people who are informed, responsible, and have a reasoned commitment to liberal democratic values and a free and open society, or else they're going to vote that free and open society right out of existence, which is what's happened in Iraq and other countries where people have been voted. Bosnia after the war, you're asked to vote on who you want in office at a time of insecurity, and people end up voting democracy right out of the way in favor of other values. So we need balance. Where's that equilibrium point? Where's the U.S. equilibrium point? You know, it's pretty easy to detect what the consensus point might be with many of our peer liberal democracies. Places like Japan or many West European countries. You know, they're basically nation states with a coherent culture and a consensus view on where the balance lies in these big questions between the role of the state and the individual and the balance of those two forms of freedom and all of those different relationships. But it's hard for us because of that balkanization, because we have these 11 regional variables over time who have completely different takes on what the right way forward is. Well, American Character actually traces that history and that relationship between those takes. And suffice to say, we've been in dangerous realms before, at all different times. On a regional level, the early Puritans displayed the dangers of ignoring individual liberty. They gave us the Salem witch trials, right? And the conditions that inspired Nathaniel Hawthorne to write the Scarlet Letter. Not such a great and free society. Then you get the antebellum Deep South, which shows how the single-minded pursuit of individual liberty can lead you astray to a universe where the oligarchy is literally defending the liberty to enslave. On the federal level, we've been through the Gilded Age of the late 19th century, where monopoly and tyranny were becoming the norm, and people were talking about how the senators were individually owned by different industrial trusts, and they actually were, at a time when state legislatures, not the citizens, selected who the senator would be. You just had to go into a state legislature and plant that, you know, the Union Pacific Railroad's attorney and state shareholder is going to be your next senator, and it tended to be that way, which did not lead to good economic, social, or freedom outcomes for society. But we've had, oddly enough, at the federal level, a firewall against more collectivist tyranny in this country, because our regional cultures, all of them relative to other places, are highly individualistic. I mean, even Yankeedom. I mean, in the end, everything I've said about Yankeedom, you're still dealing with the Calvinist work ethic, right? That classic idea of being industrious in your own factory, your own place of work. Those are all very deep individualistic values that skew the entire country much more in the individualistic frame. So efforts even to move into the social democratic zone of that spectrum map I've showed have been pushed back time and time again. Some of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's programs, even at a time of crisis, you know, recovering from the Great Depression with almost, you know, calls for him to become a dictator, things like the National Industrial Recovery Act, which is kind of really pushing into social democracy, where you would say, we're going to tightly manage the economy for the common good, you know, we're going to set the price of rubber bands that you can charge at a retail store. That got knocked down very quickly. Ditto when Lyndon Johnson tried to push the Great Society and have the federal government try to directly fix poverty, win the war on Vietnam and the like, and ended up overpromising beyond the federal government's ability to do those things. And also had a very fast, in 1 year after the Great Society started, the congressional midterms deprived LBJ of a majority and pretty much ended the sort of ascendancy in the long New Deal era. Of course, when I finished the manuscript of this book, this was in the spring of 2015. The book came out in March 2016. I was sort of sounding a warning, because the country's been paralyzed in this polarized matrix and not able to move forward, that the shoals of tyranny might lie ahead, somewhere in the middle distance, right? That we would strike them if we didn't correct course. And I was thinking, frankly, you know, 6 or 10 years down the road, not that within months of the book being published, we would have a non-liberal threat against the democracy. Now, how did that happen? Well, the 2016 election was pretty unusual. Here are the 2016 results by county. You can see the American nations kind of traced into there. Now, for the most part, you see exactly the same pattern as all these other closely contested elections. Left Coast and New Netherland and Yankeedom and El Norte all voted Democratic pretty solidly. And then with Tidewater and being sort of a mixed swing nation, and then the Deep South and Far West and Greater Appalachia is expected solidly on the other side. But the margin of victory by nation is what's actually surprising. There were some shifts, and the shifts aren't really probably where you expect they might be. You had the same pattern, same overall result will be expected and predicted by American nations by nation. Here you have the shift. But the depth of the color is how big the margins were. And the biggest differences in what actually allowed Donald Trump to win the Electoral College narrowly over Hillary Clinton, despite coming out of nowhere and being sort of an unknown without a political dynasty. Hillary Clinton only won the Midlands by 0.4%, the great swing nation. Obama won him by 11 and 6 points in his 2 elections. That is a huge shift. She basically, in the Midlands, was a tie. And the Midlands is usually the Kingmaker in a lot of our elections, and includes a big strip across key swing states, which is why they are swing states, like Ohio and Pennsylvania, and even Missouri that used to be a swing state, and cost her all those votes. But also, she only won Yankeedom, the greater New England cultural space, by 9 points. That's pretty significant, except that Obama won it by 19 in 2008 and 16 in 2012. That's an enormous loss. And that's where, all the other nations, the margins are not that different than Romney's margins for Trump. It's those gains in those 2 spots that, compared to 2012, made a difference, and more critically, made the difference on the Electoral College map. And it's interesting that those are the big gains that allowed that were concentrated in certain sorts of places in Yankeedom in particular. Up here's the 2012 results. Down here's 2016, so you can sort of see by comparison. Now look in the Yankeedom space. You will see a disappearance of a lot of blue counties that went for Trump. Guess what? There's like 100, 120 rural, almost entirely white, not particularly affluent Yankee counties that voted by good margins for Barack Obama in both elections and flipped strongly to Trump this time around. I call them, the Trump Democrats, having shifted over, like the Reagan Republicans, and shifted over. And they all have those same characteristics throughout of that shift. And the key places are northern New England, including District 2 in Maine, the upstate zones of New York that we were talking about, and especially the anomalous area that bothers political scientists because it doesn't conform to what they expect, in the upper Mississippi Valley, where Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois come together, that always and consistently have voted Democratic in recent elections, even though they're supposed to be voting Republican, shifted strongly to the Republican side. So therein lies the key zone. Now, why is that? Well, I don't have the data that will tell you exactly. I haven't gone out and polled these people, but I have a working hypothesis on that, and it's this. This election was very different, as you all noticed, in a lot of respects, but in the terms I've been talking about, for the first time in living memory, and the first time maybe since Civil War, the menu items were different. In every other presidential election, essentially, voters were asked, you got one candidate who's more clearly on the individual freedom emphasis side, and another one is more on the free community side of things. And you take your choice in one direction or another, and these nations tend to line up, consistently. Republicans in 1916 were the party of a strong government, and those kind of Yankee ideas were imbued in the party at that time, and that's why they voted in that direction. Donald Trump was an exception. He did not run the same way. Of the 17 candidates for the Republican nomination this year, Trump was the only one of all of them that did not pledge the classic Republican: less taxes, less regulation, less government will be more freedom. None of those things. On the campaign trail, he promised strong social protections. Nobody's going to touch Social Security, Medicare. We're going to repeal Obamacare and give you something terrific and better that will insure more people more cheaply. Somehow, we will intervene and bring back American manufacturing, which require enormous public intervention. And we're not going to follow the neoliberal paradigm of free trade. I'm suspicious of NAFTA and new agreements with China and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and even the free movement and immigration of people, which is strongly supported by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce crowd. All completely not part of the Republican playbook. He was the most communitarian-shifted Republican nominee in living memory. And he was able to, he was running in that fashion, and he was running against a opponent who, while trying to run in Barack Obama's legacy, was able to be painted in both the primary and the general election with her own husband's neoliberalism as president. And guess what? Neoliberalism does not have a very good lock on the American electorate. It probably hasn't in a long time, but it certainly doesn't now. And in the 2016 election, there was a huge response from relatively communitarian voting zones to Trump's message, given that as a menu choice that really shifted the election. Now, of course, there's also a danger to this in American nations terms. Oh, you can see it, by the way, in the primaries, too. Here's the Democratic primary this past year. Green is Bernie Sanders and yellow is Clinton by county. So you can see it, and even into the Democratic space. Same thing, right? You actually had, I just did a whole speech about how social democracy has a firewall against it. Well, you had a avowed social democrat who ran a competitive campaign almost to the end against, the most powerful Democratic political dynasty. And again, the more communitarian zones of the country were rallying around Sanders, and the more individualistic ones were rallying to Hillary. So you could see that difference there. Here in Maine, you see a similar patterns. I mean, Maine's all Yankeedom and all rural, but you can see by municipality, that's the election results. And I think you'll notice that almost every large population center was voting for Hillary over Trump, and all of the more advantaged coastal communities that make up a lot of CD1, same thing. And American nations maps follow a county-level resolution. If you zoomed into the municipal level, New France would spread over the New Brunswick border into the upper St. John Valley. Aroostook County is clearly not New France, but those communities are, and they're an exception up there at the top. So you see the same patternings even if you zoom in at the Maine level. So the big danger, of course, in Trumpism is that Trump wasn't running as a liberal Democrat, right? He may have had that communitarian space, but he was running at something that I, as a foreign correspondent based in Europe, have seen many times before, which is a European-style ethno-nationalist. And that's a very different argument, right? Because the argument isn't, I'm going to bring the broad social protections of the state to all of you. There's a small subset of people who are coded as being the worthy, the real Hungarians, the real Germans, the real Americans, and there are internal traitors for whom those things should be withheld. Protections for you, extra legal and perhaps extra constitutional remedies for those who've been undermining the nation and the state. So that's a very dangerous thing that we've never seen at that level. And it's a very dangerous internal threat for the Republic, probably the largest since the Civil War in the Gilded Age. If we survive all of that, we're going to need to rebuild and do so on some kind of solid foundations. And the book does indeed try to identify the sweet spot. Now I'm going to give you a sketch and encourage you to dive in, pull it from the library, get it on Kindle. And this is not what Colin Woodard wants. This is based on an evaluation of our historical experience with these things, what would actually work to give you a regional supermajority and be able to move forward. And the central argument in a nutshell is that if there's an American way, it's this idea that we've had deep in our country that's a broad consensus idea that what we're about is the pursuit of happiness via free and fair competition between individuals and their ideas and their institutions, a belief that in aggregate, if everyone's free to go do that out there and may the best person win, this would create a dynamic and adaptable and healthy and, yes, free society with all this stuff moving around in ideas and allowing the old to shift and the new ideas to come in, that dynamism is central to the American idea and that idea of meritocracy. But there's an important qualification that's also always been in our experience, and that's that Americans want that competition to be free and to be fair, that people aren't cheating, either via monopolistic or parasitic behavior, that the government will be strong enough to regulate and prevent all of that stuff from going on, because Americans get furious about those things when they don't, right? Recall the Tea Party movement really took off. The moment it took off was when the AIG insurance division guys, the ones who almost brought down the world economy with multi-billion-dollar losses, when it was learned that they were all going to get bonuses effectively paid for by all the taxpayers, and their little division in Connecticut was receiving death threats, and they had to shut down, and people resigned rather than go to work. And that's the moment when Congress just saw this white-hot explosion of resistance and anger over that. Political figures from Ronald Reagan to Paul LePage have made taking alleged welfare cheats the central idea of their campaigns, and with great political success. In both cases, bankers on one side, people taking when they should be working on the other. The anger is based on the idea among many people that taxpayers, that ordinary people are somehow being cheated by the unscrupulous. And it's government that's supposed to protect our freedom from these external and internal threats, to ensure that the competition is fairly played. And that's that government that would offer a hand, not a hand up instead of a hand out, but rather one that's got your back as you go out into this great competitive struggle that we all talk about, which requires rechanneling into a lot of those institutions that allow that to happen. So, it has a long bipartisan tradition that the book talks about, from Abraham Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt through Eisenhower and even Obama, and a whole set of intellectuals from Francis Fukuyama on through Michael Gerson. And indeed, It's all encoded in the preamble of the Constitution itself, the part where it lays out the purpose of this whole American experiment, right? Promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our prosperity. That's ensuring the common good and individuals' liberty intergenerationally. There's nothing that I would argue is more American than that particular combination. And I'm going to stop there and open it up to questions. Thank you. You mean at the sort of federal level, the big picture? Right. Well, excellent questions. So the questions are, first of all, what would happen if Marine Le Pen, the leader of the sort of neo-fascist, I think is a safe term to use, National Front in France, who's just made it to the runoff round against a neophyte political centrist in the French elections, what would happen and be the implications of that? It's a good question because all of this I'm talking about, this sort of new crisis of 2016 we're talking about, is not confined to the United States. It's a crisis throughout liberal democracy, or what we call the West, that's affecting all across Europe. You're seeing it with the challenges in the Dutch election and Brexit, and in the French election, and in the rise of Viktor Orban and the far-right Jobbik in Hungary, and all sorts of other places where the basic ideas and the commitment to the idea of trying to build universally free societies based on, those tolerance and rule of law are starting to slip against a ethno-nationalist far-right force with a very different idea. And that's the danger if Marine Le Pen were to win the French election. France is, the most significant state left in Europe other than Germany. And if you lose France, essentially the European project, it doesn't exist anymore in the sense that we're used to thinking of it. It would be a rump set of European nations that could no longer claim itself to be Europe once you've lost Britain and France. That's an awful lot of what we kind of think of historically, culturally, and just in geopolitical strength as Europe. And that would be, the concern has been that would start a momentum towards an increase in illiberal democracies or authoritarian states along the lines of Russia or what's been happening in Turkey. Or even in Hungary, a European Union member state, which is closing down the most successful and prestigious university it has on political grounds. So yeah, that would be very dangerous. The good news is that polling in France has been excellent, and in the first round of the election, which had 11 candidates, they nailed every single one of them by 1% margin, and there's now only 2 candidates, and the polling for the second round shows that the centrist does not have just a 2 or 3 point advantage, as would have been the case, say, in the Trump-Clinton presidential election, but I think it's, 23 or 26 point? I mean, it's a massive advantage, and polling is pretty accurate. So I would say that the results that we've just heard are actually pretty much the death knell for Marine Le Pen's hopes to win the presidency this year. But it's going to be a massive and significant party in the French, going from fringe to a real bloc that can't be ignored. So, the problem's not gone away, but it's a sign that the flood tide of that sentiment is already pulling back. Maybe there's even some sense with the Trump effect of having the most powerful country in the world led under those influences that maybe that's something that's giving a different motivation within a lot of the European electorates. Because the Dutch also voted much more against their far-right Geert Wilders and his party than were expected. So you may be seeing a shift now. And your second question was about, remind me, one word. Oh, right, so what will happen in our political space, right? Well, that's a big question, right? I wish I knew exactly what the answer is. But, you have a situation where obviously the political establishment and the assumptions it has have been very wrong about lots of things. And I think writ large, both in America and Europe, what I've always said draws things together because, I was based in Eastern Europe and the Balkans with the collapse of communism for years afterwards and covered the rise of ethno-nationalism in those places and the aftermath of the Bosnian War, the rise of fascist parties in far-left ones and Vladimir Putin and all the rest. I mean, it's a tricky universe, but in the end, people don't vote. We're not, homo economicus. We never have been. These ideas that, those voters are voting against their economic self-interest. Well, yeah, people do that all the time because we're not just economic beings. People are voting in what they perceive to be other interests, social interests, cultural interests, and one deep idea that's in in the human, condition is this idea of belonging and culture and what we're embedded in and what we see as familiar and the values and norms in our language. And when all of that seems under threat, which Hungarians feel, joining a small people spinning a Finno-Ugric language surrounded by all of these other peoples, and it's a somewhat closed stance to the nation. I lived there for like 5 years, and suddenly they're part of open borders and people moving around, and the idea of Hungarianness is somehow being diluted. In the same sense, out in Little Britain, out in the countryside, in Cornwall and Yorkshire, that suddenly it's not English anymore, that there are these foreign people with different values and dress and religion, and that's actually eroding your place in your culture. People vote on that stuff. It becomes more important than economic arguments. And there's something of that to be said happening in this country as well. The Trump electorate, there's many parts of it, but one part of it, which I think also may play into the Trump Democrats I just described, is this idea of this sort of erosion of what you value in your cultural space, or at least you're perceiving that that's happening, and a reaction against that. So the sort of neoliberal consensus of the 90s, of the Bill Clinton presidency, and that was carried forth in a maybe more extreme version under George W. Bush, that whole idea that we're all economic beings and that free trade and all that's going to make everybody happy because, average wealth will go up, that's not at all true. I mean, that's been pretty thoroughly politically discredited now across the Western world, and requires a rethink that, people care about economics, of course, but there are other things that matter too, especially if your economic system is not delivering for 40, 50, 60% of the population. Then your neoliberal model is really in trouble, which has happened in a lot of the areas that voted for Trump and a lot of the areas that have voted the way they have in Europe as well. But I think that's kind of a secondary effect, although I don't have the data. I think the first effect is about identity and our humanness and these other things that are enormously valuable that somehow don't get to be part of the political conversation in a sophisticated way. It's understandable, right? Because the whole history of that, national chauvinism has a dark past, with genocide and people being shot into ditches. It's a dangerous thing to engage with, but it's still there. And you have to figure out a way to healthily engage these kind of things without slipping off into the dark side of Holocaust and eugenics and the rest. So, good questions, though. Thank you. Yes, sir, with the blue.
Why do you think the polls for the 2016 election were so inaccurate?
Well, they weren't. The national polls were quite accurate. Within 2 or 3 points, they were right? They got them, and you had a major change. The bombshell of the Comey letter shifted everything by about 2 points, so you compensate for that. And at a national level, the polling was fine. The problem was that in certain swing states, especially Michigan and Wisconsin, they weren't fine, and everyone was saying it who was following, like Nate Silver at 538, who tracks this stuff, was like, he was saying, I remember in the last month before the election, we don't have any good polls coming out of some of these states. And the reason for that, everybody, is because the local media and the dailies in all of these places have atrophied. They don't have the money anymore at the Milwaukee Journal and the, maybe the Star Tribune in Minneapolis does, but many of these papers are parts of giant chains that don't care. They're not going to spend on polling for what's happening statewide in Michigan. So as newspapers, which often were the sponsors of many of the statewide polls, the Press Herald and the Bangor paper do them here in Maine, but as they become more atrophied, and our media environment, our dailies are in much better shape than when I go out across the country. I can't believe it. I was doing this Politico series where I was doing a big story from a different city all last year, all across the country, and I would pick up the daily newspapers in major cities and just be floored. The Detroit News, the Oregonian, right? Here's the newspaper of record for the state of Oregon and Portland, Oregon, right? Rich, affluent, literate city with tons of money. And I picked up this little tabloid thing about this big with 6 pages in it. And most of it was wire stories. There was one original news side story, 200 words about a polar bear at the local zoo. 3 locally sourced sports stories and 2 op-eds on the back page. What? I mean, it made the Press Herald look like, the Sunday New York Times. I mean, it was really a sobering moment. So that's why, is that we don't have the polls, and people knew it, right? So that's why there's more and better of them. So, yes, in the back.
Yes, hi. Thank you firstly so much for really illuminating perspective on our dilemmas at the moment. One of the things I was kind of curious about, one of the things that really struck me, there was a moment that struck me which was not actually a moment having to do with the presidential candidates, but with the confirmation processes that occurred afterwards for when they were filling the cabinet. And what struck me was, and I realize now what it was, the way you frame sort of the the ways we have traditionally, the different ways we've traditionally considered freedom, this quality of freedom.
Yeah.
The one that really stunned me, and I think it was Elizabeth Warren asked Ben Carson, who was being evaluated for Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, about can you guarantee that no money will go into the pockets of Donald Trump or any of his affiliated business activities. And he replied, if I recall, and I'm not going to get this verbatim, but more or less, if $10 of every like 100 or something goes into somebody's pockets, but we get a good product in the end. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but that was more or less his response, which in this moment strikes me very much like he's playing both sides of that identity question of protecting an oligarchy, but at the same time trying to use that as a tool to provide the common good.
Right. Well, I mean, that's, that Ben Carson's, fairly new to politics, and I think his reading and understanding of the past political history is probably kind of thin. But what he's saying happens to echo strongly with the old city party machines, right? Mayor Daley's Chicago, right? It's terribly corrupt, staggeringly corrupt, but everybody votes for him because he makes everything run, right? The corruption, greases the system and everything rolls along. That was the argument of those big party boss machines. So he's suggesting a universe in which we return to that, and if 10 or 20% skimmed off the top, if they're delivering results, hey, what's not to like? Yeah, I mean, that's obviously it's problematic and was in Chicago and has all kinds of unfortunate secondary effects. But I don't know if that's his remarks. I don't recall hearing them. They don't necessarily feed into the oligarchy argument because you can have those old machines too, right? That aren't necessarily democratic and open, but deliver the goods, which sometimes people are happy with that at the municipal level. How much time do we have for, can I continue? One more question. Who's going to be good? Yes? Yeah, it'll be you.
So, for people who are in the minority or allies with minorities and people that don't bother to enter the Senate and
Right.
and go on every minority and go on the list with the rhetoric, do you see us the country falling more into a Nazi Germany setting than all over the world, and we've seen? Do you see us going into that path, or?
Well, I mean, the shift has some worrying parallels that I see from my time in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. I mean, absolutely enough to be concerned about those things, and everyone rightly should be. I would say that in the past few months, the great question is, are the American people fundamentally decent and committed to liberal values, openness, and tolerance, and not, attacking people based on ethno-nationalist assumptions? That's the big question, right? That will decide whether or not the republic continues in its form as an open society. I've actually been relatively encouraged by the evidence so far. That especially that travel ban that infected, including actual green card holders, and those people just pouring into airports and blocking them across the country pretty much spontaneously, is a pretty good expression of there being a sizable bloc that is not going to put up with those sorts of things, and the courts have stood up so far, for their rulings and stuff. So, that's the question, but I'm cautiously optimistic. It's unfortunate that we have to have the stress test at all. Yeah.
There's a few other students here from Maine history that
Sure.
might have a couple more questions. If you have
As long as time you have, I've got the time. Yep. So I want to hold it. If everyone needs to go to class and I'm messing you up, stop me. But. Yes, please. I'm sorry, I missed the very beginning of your question. Well, the American nation stuff, I wasn't particularly interested in American politics or even particularly in American history when I was, your age and in college. I graduated from college in 91, so I started in 87, and that was the end of perestroika and glasnost, and the Soviet Union was going on. Mikhail Gorbachev was there. It's the Cold War we'd grown up with, and the country divided, the world divided into two competing camps, and the risk that there was going to be a nuclear war at any time, we'd all be destroyed, and that was all appeared to maybe be thawing out, and something would happen. So I was a Soviet East European, history and Balkan studies major, and went and spent my junior year abroad in Budapest, Hungary, in what turned out to be the fall of '89, arrived under communism and watched it all collapse. And that hooked me in that. I was into that, is what I was studying, into that whole universe for a number of years, traveling and covering that part of the world. What got me interested in this stuff is that, everyone knows their history for better or worse in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, maybe for the worse, but our country is very historically amnesiatic. In that part of the world, the lines that really matter, the big cultural boundaries, do not necessarily match the boundaries on the map at all. You can go as you're crossing Romania or Poland, you can feel and sense and almost see when you cross the lines between the old Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg one, or the Habsburg one and the Prussian one, all the way down to the attitudes of the people getting on and off the train you're on. It was when I came back after that. I came back to the U.S. and started living in other areas of the U.S. that, not in Yankeedom, so to speak. I lived in southernmost Texas and in D.C. in the Tidewater Zone and in Chicago and traveling around there. And what blew me away is, oh my gosh, the differences between our regions were staggering on cultural terms and all the stuff I'm talking about, greater than the differences between any of the two European Union states or the Balkan states. Huge differences, and they didn't follow state boundaries. Oftentimes they cleaved right through states. I remember a friend of mine when I was living in D.C. was a native of Annapolis, and we had a little 20-foot day sailboat that we kept out on the coast to get away. We shared the expenses on. We'd drive out there, and we would talk about when is the moment when you leave that sort of Midlandish, German-feeling, industrial, Baltimore, Fredericksburg, Philly, kind of zone, Montgomery County. When is that moment when you enter and fall into the plantation south of the tobacco plantations and that whole heritage of the great planters of Virginia? And we would talk about it. We would go block by block, and he would hit the moments when it's here. And we'd talk about it's here. We'd drive around, and because he was a student of history as well and grew up there, and you could see the shift and the de facto segregated softball teams when you went on one side of the zone and not on the other side, and all of those things. Anyway, that all got me very interested in it, and it percolated for 15 years. I did some other books on colonial history, both because I started getting interested in the fact that, a lot of what we are and our challenges as Americans and our misunderstandings about our identity and what we're supposed to be all about are because the colonial period's a lot more complicated than anyone ever teaches us, right? These colonies did not think they were going to be part of one country when they formed. For 150 years, they developed assuming they were separate countries. Some of them belonged to different empires. And they had all these different traditions and ethnographies and religions. And the staggering part is they're still kind of there, right? And if you understood that, you started grasping it. I wrote Lobster Coast about Maine, kind of American nations writ small. Why is coastal Maine the way it is? I grew up in Maine. What's this whole from away thing we have? Why is it, if a car from Massachusetts, cuts you off on 295, you're like, ah, in a way that you wouldn't be if it was Vermont plates. What's up with that, And it's this colonial experience that goes, people don't know the history, but the impact of having been a colony of a colony ruled by a metropole, which Maine was from the 1650s to 1820, carries a long tail of resentment and subservient status and this idea that we're second best in Maine, which doesn't necessarily be true, but all these parallels with our colonial experience that people from the Indian subcontinent would recognize that are all infused in this place, because we're the only colony that was absorbed by another colony and ruled in its interest from afar in the entire American experience. So all these deep history things matter. It got me really interested and more interested in it. And I kept working towards American nations when doing the pirate book and the lobster book and kind of giving myself my own doctorate in American history, but inspired by what the contrast between and parallels and differences I'd seen with the Balkans and transposed here. So that's your long-winded answer as to what got me interested in it. Any other from the history group? Yes, please.
Do you have any thoughts on ranked choice voting?
Oh gosh, ranked choice voting. I guess I don't have a strong position on it one way or the other. I mean, I understand the merits of the idea of the argument that you would try to ensure majorities. I don't know. I'm not sure whether there's a constitutional problem is actually going to be there or not. So I'm sort of following it. And things that I cover, regularly, I may have to cover that in the newspaper, so I try not to take a preordained position, but I actually don't have a strong notion of it. I mean, the idea that, I think the advantage of it is the idea that, oh gosh, I can't run for office because I'd be the spoiler, right? And then everyone's second guessing who's the spoiler. I mean, if you could have, like the French just had a 2-round election, it's not ranked choice voting, right? They have 2 rounds. Okay, we had 11 people, and now we're going to have the 2 top candidates, and we're going to vote for them. I mean, that's a pretty good system because you're going to get a majority. And it's not even ranked choice. You can actually, go have the second round. So there's some merit to that idea because you know that the person there is not, hated by 75% of the country, right? You know that 51% at least went for it. Then you got the Electoral College, but that's a separate thing. But, yeah. Yes, please.
So you talked about some really big ideas and some really big scale patterns. And you've alluded to some pretty dramatic changes in the media, which have been accelerating. And you're a journalist. And I wondered if you could comment on the importance of knowing what's going on in order to have opinions and be politically active in an era where fake news is a phenomenon that is accelerating. So I wondered.
Yeah, well, I mean, everyone thought that the internet, right, the democratization of information was going to increase democratic values, right? Everyone would be informed and stuff. It's turned out to not be the case, right? You can now disseminate the most outrageous falsehoods very effectively through social media channels, and turns out a substantial and significant number of people cannot tell the difference between a fake news site that was completely invented and a real one. And unfortunately, those things go viral if your job is to sit in some room, whether you're paid by the Russians or you're just doing it for ad money or whatever it is, your job is to sit there and try to figure out a way to provoke the most possible web hits you can. You're going to pick the most incendiary thing that plays to this demographic, is going to love this, eat it up, be outraged by it, and share it madly everywhere. And there are all, thousands of people employed to do this, either simply out of greed or maybe for other purposes. And that seeded the entire environment where there's no set of facts you can, rely on. Nobody will believe that even if the New York Times makes mistakes, and they certainly do, and usually they own up to them, but that's a totally different thing than completely inventing and making up news for the purpose of deceiving or making money. And that's a massive part of the mediascape now that is drowning out the actual facts. And once we're completely, untethered from facts, then anything is possible, and that's not a good thing in a republic, right? It's relying on all of us to know what's going on, because we have to make those broad decisions about the direction we're going to go forward on, and they need to be based somehow in reality, not in just some invented fantasy from some Macedonian guy's, basement in a village. And, that's what's happening now. So yeah, it's an enormously dangerous. So I'm hoping that the experience of all that is, that the public is kind of becoming aware of it, and that people will maybe realize that they need to pay a little closer attention to the source of things before they share them. I mean, I hope that's a learning curve, because the social media is pretty new to all of us, because it's new to the entire planet. But people hopefully will develop some more sophisticated ideas, and I do think that schools, at a lower level, elementary and junior high level, probably need to be starting to teach some kind of sort of basic news literacy, since everything is fed immediately, and it's not immediately obvious if you're a young person what the difference is between the fake thing and the real one, because they kind of look the same. So, thank you. Oh, yes, sir.
Quick question, maybe not quick. I teach a class on globalization here. I spend a lot of time trying to talk about shifts in capitalism relative to political outcomes. So a couple of points or just questions for you, try to be quick. But just looking at the U.S. scenario, looking at unionization rates in 1950 versus today, for example, you talk about that in your book, I don't know. Right? 40% of the workforce was unionized in 1950. Today we're thinking 12%.
Right.
So how does that play into your focus here on identity?
Well, identity and culture, it's almost if the book's central discussion, and the book isn't really, American Character isn't directly taking on the identity and culture stuff. We're talking that's sort of understanding the Trump phenomenon. American Nations looks at the regional cultures and what the differences are between them. If this is looking at the individualism, common good, and the dangers of excess in either direction, the decline of unionization and all of those other metrics of inequality are all classic pathologies that start forming when you're getting too far on the oligarchic side of things. And you're seeing the undermining of the possibility of people born in less privileged circumstances realizing their potential. That's starting to be foreclosed upon. And you're starting to see the sense that cheating is going on, discrediting the political system, political institutions, politicians, established media, and everything else. Nothing is to be trusted. They're all in cahoots, right? Because, the 2008, the entire world economy was almost destroyed, and nobody was punished for it, Who went to jail, right? A few people in Iceland. So those are all, I would describe as indications that perhaps you're going too far into one angle there.
But aren't they certainly reinforcing the cut as we get less equal economically? Aren't we pushing back into these nativist identities that you are?
Well, so ethno-nationalism, nativism, far-right xenophobia, these are all non-liberal democratic values. So if you are destabilizing the apple cart of maintaining a republic and an open society and a liberal democracy, one of the alternatives to living in a free society is living in an ethno-nationalist state, or fascism or xenophobia, and all of those things you're talking about are all non-liberal democratic value alternative forms of government that,
The solution basically is to redistribute economically.
or at least you cannot maintain a liberal democracy without maintaining and investing in the social and physical and cultural infrastructure that allows us as individuals to be able to practice freedom, right? Now, otherwise, it's a creation and a lattice work that allows us as individuals to have the possibility of having enough autonomy, protection under the law, and counting on rule of law, and not having to be armed personally to stop bandits outside your door, and have those kind of trust mechanisms and each other. I mean, those are all things that require all of that stuff. And to be informed enough to make decisions in a complex, industrial and post-industrial society, you got to be able to read and write and know a whole bunch of stuff that's going on. People have, most of the population has to be educated and have critical thinking skills, or it doesn't work. So yeah, I think all of that.
And just one more thing, you talked about neoliberalism and free trade. This is just because I'm thinking this globalization
Yeah.
last time, but just push back on a concept a little bit.
Sure.
So if you think about the World War II period, roughly from 1945 to the early 70s, the Democratic Party was a liberal, it was liberal with trade, but redistributive at home, right? So you had Keynesian welfare states that tried to redistribute income, relatively speaking, but at the same time, the FDR project was a free trade project. So what has changed since the 1970s is that, yes, still free trade, but no redistribution. So you said neoliberalism means free trade, whatever. But right, there are free trade models. Scandinavia, for example, some of the most open trade societies in the world, but the most redistributive at the same time.
Right. You can have free trade and be redistributive, but I'm saying that the discontent with neoliberalism, one of the points that people don't like about it is the free trade aspect of it that is generating the political animus against other aspects.
And I would argue that that comes from the fact that the redistributive element has been pulled out of politics.
Sure. Yeah, well, I think neoliberalism, as I'm using it, is the new liberalism as in the John Locke liberalism, what we would call more libertarian or laissez-faire. That neo part, people start talking about that, after, maybe Carter, but you're really talking about sort of Clintonism and onwards and forwards, when that is exactly, I wouldn't say that neoliberalism lost the redistributive part. From the moment we started using that term, that was the redistributive part scaled back, and the liberalizing of the economy increased is part and parcel of the definition as we understand it in the American vocabulary. I would not use the term neoliberal for the Great Society or the FDR period, right? So I think it's a matter of definitions. But.
Or just that the politics of Trump has focused on the protection versus the redistribution, right? So that the free trade agreements becomes actually the focus when actually the concern should be redistribution.
Well, Trump on the campaign trail was promising kind of both, right? End of the trade deals, and we'll trust your Social Security, and we'll have, wonderful Obamacare, and we'll rebuild factories, and we're going to spend $1 trillion in infrastructure. Those are all big New Deal-ish items. I don't think any of them are happening in governance, but that was what he was elected on, had a lot of those elements. Yeah, it had both, right? It was like the anti-neoliberal in several respects. And, you know, one that the Republican electorate went for it, and in general, a lot of the general electorate went for it too, so.
Well, and we hope you enjoyed your afternoon with us. We certainly
Thank you, I did.
enjoyed you sharing your ideas with us. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you all. Thanks.